She smiled at me from the other side of the screen door. That thin, careful smile she always saved for moments she'd already won. "The lawyer was very clear, Nathan," my stepmother said. "Your father's estate goes to the family." I was 23 years old, standing on the porch of the house I grew up in, with a duffel bag at my feet and nowhere to go. She didn't open the door. She didn't have to. The lock clicked a second later, soft and final, like a period at the end of a sentence I hadn't finished reading. My father, Donald Carmichael, had died 6 weeks earlier. Heart attack, they said. "Quick," the doctor told us. Probably didn't feel much. I repeated that to myself 100 times in those first weeks, the way you repeat something trying to make it feel true. He'd built a construction management firm from nothing, Carmichael and Associates, based out of Hamilton, Ontario. 40 years of work, contracts across the province, a reputation that meant something in this city. He'd started it before I was born, and when I was old enough to understand what he did, I was already proud of him. He was also, for most of my life, the kind of father who showed up, not in a showy way. He came to my hockey games and sat in the cold rink with bad coffee and never complained. He taught me to drive in an empty Canadian Tire parking lot on a Sunday morning, both of us laughing when I misjudged the curb. He wasn't perfect. He worked too much. He went quiet sometimes in ways I didn't understand until I was older, but he was present, and I think that mattered more than anything else. He married Diane 3 years after my mother passed. I was 15. I tried. I genuinely tried. But there was always something watchful about Diane, something that calculated before it spoke. Her son, Bryce, was a year older than me and made no effort at all. He wore my father's last name like a coat he'd borrowed and never intended to return. When Dad got sick the first time, a scare with his heart 2 years before he died, I came home from university and spent the whole summer. I cooked. I drove him to appointments. I sat with him in the evenings watching old hockey games he'd already seen a dozen times. Diane was there too, but she managed things. She made calls and handled paperwork and introduced herself to his lawyers and his accountants in a way that felt, even then, like positioning. I went back to school that fall thinking everything was fine. It wasn't. The will was read 12 days after the funeral. I sat in a boardroom downtown with a lawyer named Everett Sloan, my father's supposed longtime counsel, and listened to a document that left everything to Diane. The firm, the house, the accounts, all of it. A brief acknowledgement of me, his son, with a single line, a generous spirit who will find his own path. I sat very still through the whole reading. I remember the air conditioning humming. I remember Bryce checking his phone under the table. I remember thinking, my father never once, in 32 years, told me I would need to find my own path. He told me I already had one. I said nothing. I walked out. I drove to a Tim Hortons on King Street and sat in the parking lot for 2 hours and didn't order anything. 3 weeks later, Diane asked me to be out of the house by the end of the month. So that's how I ended up on that porch with a duffel bag, watching her turn away from the screen door, already moving toward the kitchen, already done with me. I stayed on a friend's couch in Kitchener for the first few weeks. Derek was patient about it. He didn't ask many questions, which was the kindest thing anyone did for me in that period. I got a job at a lumberyard, physical work which I needed, and tried to figure out what I was supposed to do next. I kept coming back to the will, not to the loss of it, though that was real enough, but to the wrongness of it. My father had talked to me about the firm my whole life. He'd told me, twice in the year before he died, that he wanted me involved when I graduated. He'd said it plainly, in that straightforward way of his. He wasn't a man who said things he didn't mean. The document I'd heard in that boardroom didn't sound like him. The language was formal in a way his voice wasn't. The provisions made no sense for a man who cared about legacy, about continuity, about what he was building lasting past him. I didn't know what to do with that feeling for a long time. I just carried it. Then, about 2 months after I moved out, I got a letter. It came to Derek's address, which was strange. I hadn't given that address to anyone connected to my father. It was in a plain envelope, no return address, postmarked from Hamilton. Inside was a single index card with my father's handwriting on it. I recognized it immediately. He wrote in block capitals always, a habit from reading blueprints for 40 years. It said, north of Parry Sound, County Road 18 past the turnoff. Look for the white mailbox with no number. The key is in the birdhouse. Nothing else, no explanation, no signature, just the address and a clarity in those words that felt completely, unmistakably like him. I stared at it for a long time. Why would a man who'd built a company worth several $1,000,000 own a property in a remote part of cottage country, a place so quiet it didn't even have a numbered mailbox? I took a Saturday in late October, and I drove north. The Trans-Canada had that flat gray light it gets before the first real cold sets in. Past Barrie, the landscape opened up, and the trees closed in, and by the time I turned off onto County Road 18, I was somewhere that felt genuinely remote. Not the managed wilderness of a provincial park. The real thing, rock faces rising out of the Canadian Shield, birch trees going yellow at the edges, the kind of silence that has weight. I almost missed the mailbox. It was white, exactly like the card said, and it sat at the end of a narrow gravel lane so overgrown at the entrance that it looked like it hadn't been used in years. I pulled over and sat there a moment. Had someone else already been here? Had they beaten me to whatever this was? I got out and walked the lane. About 150 meters in, the trees opened onto a clearing, and there it was, a cedar cabin, a frame, older but solid. The wood had gone silver gray with weather. The porch had a single Muskoka chair that had seen better winters. The windows were intact. The place was locked, obviously, but it was standing, and it hadn't been touched. I could see the undisturbed leaves on the steps, the spider webs across the door frame, the small birdhouse mounted on a post beside the walkway. The key was there, just where he said. Inside, the cabin was simple. One main room, a small kitchen, a sleeping loft above, a wood stove in the corner, shelves along one wall with a few paperbacks and a couple of old fishing reels. It smelled like cedar and cold and that specific stillness of a place no one has opened in a long time. I stood in the middle of that room and felt something break open in my chest. Not in a bad way, exactly. More like a window being forced that had been painted shut. He'd been here. This was his, and somehow he'd made sure I would find it. I spent an hour going through the cabin slowly, not sure what I was looking for. And then, in the sleeping loft, pushed back against the far wall under the eave, I found the trunk. It was an old military footlocker, the kind with the metal clasps and the rounded top. It wasn't locked. Inside, under a folded Hudson's Bay blanket that I remembered from somewhere, from my childhood, maybe, was a banker's box sealed with tape. I sat on the floor of that loft with the box on my lap, and I will tell you honestly that my hands were shaking. Inside the box was a handwritten letter, a second copy of my father's will, a USB drive, and a manila folder thick with documents. I read the letter first. He wrote it 8 months before he died, which meant he knew something was coming. He didn't say it in those exact words, but it was there in the way he wrote. Carefully, precisely, the way he'd plan a construction project. He said he had become concerned about the direction of the firm. He said that Everett Sloan, his lawyer, had been working increasingly closely with Diane on matters that should not have involved her. He said there were transactions he couldn't account for. He said he had made a second will, the one in the box, with a different solicitor, a woman named Carol Beaumont in Collingwood, and that if I was reading this letter, it meant the wrong document had been used in probate. He said he loved me. He said he was sorry he hadn't told me any of this directly. He said he didn't want to worry me until he was sure, and then he ran out of time to be sure. That last part was the one I had to stop and breathe through for a while. The second will was clear. He left the firm to me, with provisions to protect the employees and the long-term contracts. The house to me, a trust for ongoing operations. He'd thought it through completely, the way he thought through everything. The USB drive was the part that changed what this was from a family dispute into something else entirely. I drove back to Parry Sound and found a cafe with Wi-Fi and opened the drive on my laptop. There were folders inside, organized in that same methodical way my father organized everything. Emails, dozens of them, between Diane and Everett Sloan going back nearly 18 months. Financial transfers out of the firm's operating accounts, routed through a numbered company I'd never heard of. And at the bottom of one folder, a series of documents involving my father's cardiologist and a prescription adjustment that had been made without his knowledge. I sat in that cafe for 4 hours. I ordered 2 coffees and a muffin I didn't eat. I read everything twice. I am not a lawyer. I want to be clear about that. I didn't understand all of it. But I understood enough. The will had been substituted. Money had been moved, and there were questions about my father's medical care in his final months that I could not explain and could not dismiss. The drive home was the longest of my life, not because of the distance. It's maybe 2.5 hours from Parry Sound back to the city, but because I was trying to hold everything together in my head at once and keep it level. I couldn't afford to fall apart. I couldn't afford to go to anyone except the right people. I did not go to Everett Sloan. I did not go to Diane. I found Carol Beaumont's office number from the Law Society of Ontario's directory. I called her at 8 the next morning. When I told her my name, she went quiet for a second, and then she said, "I was hoping you'd call. Your father told me you would." Carol was in her 60s, sharp and unhurried, and the kind of person who made you feel like she had already considered every angle of the problem before you finished describing it. I drove to Collingwood and spent 3 hours with her. I gave her the USB drive. I gave her the letter. I gave her the second will. She told me what I had was significant. She told me that what I had was, in her professional assessment, enough. She contacted a colleague in Hamilton who specialized in estate litigation. He contacted a forensic accountant he'd worked with before. Carol reached out to the Law Society regarding Everett Sloan. The forensic accountant, once she'd been through the financial documents, referred the matter to the RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit. I want to say that what came next was fast and clean and satisfying in the way it is in movies. It wasn't. It took 7 months. There were delays and depositions and moments where I genuinely did not know which way it would go. There was a period in February where Sloan's lawyers tried to argue that the documents on the drive were fabricated, and I spent 3 weeks in a state of low, constant dread, waiting to see if that would stick. It didn't stick. The forensic analysis confirmed the documents were authentic. The financial trail was reconstructed and verified. The prescription records were obtained through the investigation and reviewed by an independent cardiologist, who concluded in writing that the dosage change in my father's final months had been clinically unjustified and had likely accelerated the cardiac event. Diane was charged with fraud, over $5,000, breach of trust, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Everett Sloan was disbarred and charged alongside her. The numbered company was traced back to both of them, with Bryce listed as a secondary beneficiary. He was charged as well. The second will was admitted to probate after the first was found to have been fraudulently substituted. Carol Beaumont was there when it was finalized, and she shook my hand in the same unhurried way she did everything and said, "Your father was a careful man." That turned out to matter. I got the firm back. I got the house back. I stood in the house on a Tuesday afternoon in June, the first time I'd been inside since Diane handed me the lock and the door, and I walked through every room slowly. The kitchen where my dad used to make his terrible scrambled eggs on Sunday mornings. Too dry, always, and he knew it, and he made them anyway. The study where he kept his blueprints rolled up in a bin by the window. The hallway where a photograph still hung, the 3 of us at Niagara Falls when I was maybe 8, my mother squinting into the sun and laughing at something. That photograph was still there. She hadn't taken it down. I sat on the back porch for a long time that afternoon and looked at the yard and thought about what I wanted to do next. I did not stay in the house. I sold it. It held too much of the wrong kind of weight, the recent years layered over the real ones, and I found I could not separate them cleanly enough to feel at home there anymore. I used a portion of the proceeds to set up a scholarship fund at the College of Trades in Hamilton, in my father's name. Donald Carmichael had always said the industry needed more young tradespeople, and that was true before, and it's still true now. I kept the cabin. I spent the following spring fixing it properly, new roof, repaired porch, the Muskoka chair replaced with two so there's room for company. I split wood on November weekends and stacked it on the south side, where my father must have stacked it before me. I put the Hudson's Bay blanket back in the trunk, folded the same way I found it. The birdhouse is still there too. The key is gone now. I keep it on my keychain, but the birdhouse stands, and last summer a pair of chickadees decided it was acceptable, and I find I don't want to change a thing about it. Some nights I sit on that porch after the sun goes behind the tree line and the lake goes dark, and I think about what my father did. He couldn't tell me. He was running out of time and he couldn't be certain, and he couldn't risk tipping anyone off before he'd secured what needed to be secured. So he left me a note on an index card in block capitals, "Look for the white mailbox with no number," and trusted that I would look. He knew I would look. The cabin is quiet in a way that settles something in me. It's not the quiet of loss, though there's always some of that. It's more like the quiet at the end of a long day of real work, when you sit down and everything aches in the good way, and you know what you did, and you know it was worth it. I think about the men and women at the firm who kept their jobs because the truth came out. I think about Carol Beaumont picking up the phone. I think about my father rolling this whole thing out like a set of blueprints, precise and patient, knowing he wouldn't be there when the building was finally done. He built things that lasted. That was who he was. He was right that I'd find my own way. He just didn't mean it the way the false will implied. He meant I was already the kind of person who would go north on a gray October Saturday, find a cabin in the trees, open a trunk, and not flinch from what was inside. I like to think I proved him right.